There is a country that was born proclaiming that all men are created equal, and in the same breath owned 400,000 human beings. A country that built the greatest democracy the world has ever seen on a foundation of stolen land and stolen lives. A country that has, in its short history, saved the world from fascism, walked on the moon, and stormed its own Capitol building. No other country on Earth produces this kind of contradiction at this kind of scale, and no other country inspires quite this level of argument about what it actually is and what it is supposed to be. The United States of America is not a simple story. Never has been. But it is without question one of the most extraordinary stories ever told, and it begins long before most people think it does. Long before Christopher Columbus set foot on a Caribbean island, the continent that would one day bear the name America was already home to hundreds of nations. Across North America, indigenous peoples had been building civilizations, governing territories, and developing rich cultures for thousands of years. They were not the wandering primitives European colonizers would later portray them as. They were sophisticated societies with complex political systems and deep spiritual traditions rooted in land they had inhabited since time beyond memory. In the Northeast, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, known to the English as the Iroquois, had developed a system of representative governance so advanced that several historians have argued it directly influenced the framers of the American Constitution. In the Mississippi Valley, the city of Cahokia, at its peak, housed more people than London. In the Southwest, the ancestral Puebloans had built multi-story stone complexes in the face of cliffs that still stand today, silent and immovable, as monuments to what was here long before anyone from Europe arrived. This was not empty wilderness waiting to be discovered. It was a world unto itself, with its own histories, its own tragedies, and its own sense of what it meant to belong to a place. Then, in 1492, Columbus cracked open a door that would never close again. Within a generation, the Spanish, English, French, Dutch, and Portuguese were all racing to map and claim this massive new frontier. The name they gave it came from a Florentine explorer named Amerigo Vespucci, who had the entrepreneurial instinct to publish detailed maps of his discoveries. The hemisphere would carry his name forever. The first Europeans who tried to build permanent homes on North American coast discovered that the continent had no interest in making life easy for them. The Roanoke colony of 1585 ended in one of history's most enduring mysteries, its settlers vanishing entirely, leaving nothing behind but two cryptic carvings in a wooden post. They were never found. The English tried again in 1607, establishing Jamestown on the James River in Virginia. It nearly collapsed a dozen times. Disease swept through the population. The swampy ground that had looked so promising from the river turned out to be a breeding ground for pestilence. It was a soldier named Captain John Smith who saved the colony, not through military force, but through relentless organization and trade with the local Powhatan people. When he returned to England, he left behind something more valuable than gold, a blueprint for survival. Jamestown endured, and in 1619 it became the site of a darker milestone when between 20 and 30 enslaved Africans arrived in Virginia, marking the beginning of what would become 2.5 centuries of bondage on American soil. A year later, a group of religious separatists crossed the Atlantic aboard the Mayflower, established a colony at Plymouth Harbor, and with the aid of the Wampanoag people, survived their first brutal winter. Their harvest celebration with the Wampanoag chief, Massasoit, would centuries later become the foundation of Thanksgiving. By the mid-18th century, Britain's American colonies had grown into something remarkable, with a population exceeding 1 million and a thriving economy built on trade, agriculture, and maritime commerce. Then came the 7 Years' War, a global conflict that began in the American wilderness when a young Virginia militia officer named George Washington confronted French troops in the Ohio River Valley. Britain won spectacularly, driving friends from most of North America, but the war had been ruinously expensive. Parliament decided the colonies should help pay for it. What followed was a decade of escalating fury. The Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, the Boston Massacre, the Boston Tea Party, and finally the Intolerable Acts pushed the colonists from resentment toward outright rebellion. The rallying cry echoed through every town and tavern, "No taxation without representation!" The moment of no return came on the morning of April 19, 1775. The night before, patriots Paul Revere and William Dowes had ridden through the Massachusetts countryside warning that British soldiers were marching towards a weapons cache at Concord. When roughly 70 colonial militiamen faced that column of British regulars on the town green at Lexington, neither side intended to fire. But then a single shot rang out, from which side no one has ever determined, and the war began. In Philadelphia, the Continental Congress tasked a 33-year-old Virginia lawyer named Thomas Jefferson with explaining to the world why these colonies were breaking away from Britain. What he produced was more than a political document. It was a philosophical declaration that governments derive their authority from the consent of the governed, and that when any government betrays its people, those people have both the right and the duty to change it. On July 4th, 1776, those immortal words became the foundation upon which everything that followed would be built. The man charged with turning those words into battlefield victory was George Washington, a Virginia colonel whose record as a commander was far from perfect, but who possessed something rarer than tactical genius: the ability to hold a ragged army together through years of cold, starvation, and defeat. His most desperate hour came on Christmas night, 1776, when he led his exhausted soldiers across an ice-choked Delaware River through a howling storm to fall on sleeping Hessian garrison at Trenton. The victory kept the Revolution alive when nothing else could. The war's true turning point came at Saratoga in October of 1777, where American forces forced the surrender of an entire British army. That victory convinced France to enter the war on the American side, transforming a colonial rebellion into a global conflict. The war ended at Yorktown in 1781, when a British army trapped with its back to the sea was forced to surrender. The Treaty of Paris, signed in 1783, formally recognized the United States of America as a sovereign nation. If this kind of history is what you came to YouTube for, then subscribe. It helps more than you might think, and there's still a great deal of more story left to tell. Winning independence turned out to be the easy part. The first attempt at national government, the Articles of Confederation, was little more than a polite suggestion. The central government could not tax, could not regulate trade, and could not compel states to honor their obligations. By 1787, the young republic was already fraying, and delegates gathered in Philadelphia to produce what became the United States Constitution, a document built around the revolutionary idea that power should be divided among three branches that could check and balance each other, with all authority ultimately derived from the people themselves. But the Philadelphia Convention had a secret. Behind the closed windows of Independence Hall, where the doors were shut to keep out both eavesdroppers and summer heat, the delegates forged the new government through a series of compromises that would haunt the nation for generations. The most consequential was the arrangement that allowed southern states to count enslaved people as 3/5 of a person for the purposes of congressional representation, granting the slaveholding states more political power precisely because of the people they held in chains. The framers knew it was a moral bargain with the devil. Many of them said so privately, but the Union, they told themselves, required it. It was the first of many times that America would defer the question of slavery in the name of political survival, and each deferral made the final reckoning that much more catastrophic. George Washington served 2 terms as the first president and set precedents that would define the office for generations, including the most important one of all, stepping down voluntarily when he easily could have ruled for life. Through the early decades of the Republic, the nation expanded with almost frenzied hunger for territory. The Louisiana Purchase doubled the country's size. The Lewis and Clark expedition mapped the vast new Western territories. The ideology of manifest destiny, the belief that the United States was divinely destined to stretch from ocean to ocean, drove relentless expansion. The cost of that expansion were enormous and fell heaviest on those with the least power to resist. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 forcibly relocated more than 60,000 Native Americans from their ancestral homelands along routes that would become known as the Trail of Tears. Around 15,000 people died. The Mexican-American War of 1846 to 1848 extended American territory all the way to the Pacific. The discovery of gold in California brought a flood of settlers west. The country was growing at breathtaking speed, but beneath all this expansion, a catastrophe was building. Slavery, which had been written into the economic foundation of the southern states since the 17th century, was the question that every compromise and every negotiation sought to avoid answering directly. A but the question refused to stay silent. The Missouri Compromise of 1820, the Compromise of 1850, the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, each one was sold as a permanent solution, and each one only bought a few more years of uneasy quiet before the pressure built again. Abolitionists like Frederick Douglass and Harriet Beecher Stowe were shifting the moral conscience of the North, while the South dug deeper into the ideology of states' rights and the so-called positive good of slavery. By the 1850s, the fault lines were too deep to paper over. John Brown's violent raid on Harper's Ferry in 1859 electrified both sides. When Abraham Lincoln won the presidency in 1860, South Carolina seceded within weeks. Other southern states followed. On April 12, 1861, Confederate artillery opened fire on Fort Sumter, and the Civil War began. 4 years and 600,000 dead later, it was over. Union General Ulysses S. Grant accepted Robert E. Lee's surrender at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9, 1865. Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation had transformed the war's moral purpose, and the 13th Amendment, passed just months before the war's end, abolished slavery in the United States forever. 6 days after Lee's surrender, Lincoln was shot at Ford's Theater by a Confederate sympathizer and died the following morning, leaving the unfinished work of Reconstruction in far less capable hands. The constitutional amendments that followed the Civil War granted Black American citizenship, equal protection under the law, and the right to vote. For a brief and extraordinary period during Reconstruction, those promises seemed real. Then, a political deal in 1877 ended Reconstruction, withdrew federal troops from the South, and handed Black Americans to the mercy of the states that had just spent 4 years fighting to keep them enslaved. A century of systematic oppression followed. Jim Crow laws imposed rigid segregation on every aspect of public life. The Ku Klux Klan roared back to life in the 1920s, with membership reaching 5 million. Lynchings, voter suppression, and legalized discrimination kept Black Americans economically impoverished and politically powerless in a country whose founding documents declared them equal. They were not alone in being told that the promise of America was not yet meant for them. Women who had organized, marched, and argued for the right to vote since the Seneca Falls Convention of 1848 did not secure that right until the 19th Amendment was ratified in 1920. And even then, Black women in the South would be systematically denied that right for another 4.5 decades. Immigrant communities faced waves of nativist hostility. Labor organizers who demanded fair wages and safe working conditions were beaten in the streets, arrested, and sometimes even killed. The history of American equality is not a steady upward line. It is a jagged, contested climb in which every advance was purchased at enormous cost by people who were told over and over that this was not the right time and this was not the right way. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s was not a sudden awakening, but the culmination of decades of organized resistance. Rosa Parks refusing to surrender her seat on a Montgomery bus, the year-long boycott that followed, the Freedom Riders beaten by white mobs in Alabama, the children of Birmingham facing fire hoses and police dogs. At the center of it all stood Martin Luther King Jr., whose strategy of nonviolent resistance proved again and again to be more powerful than violence. On August 28, 1963, standing before 250,000 people at the Lincoln Memorial, King delivered a speech that articulated the promise of America more powerfully than perhaps any other in the nation's history. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 dismantled the legal architecture of segregation. They did not end racism, but they meant, at least in law, that the words of the Declaration of Independence applied to everyone. Meanwhile, the 20th century had transformed the United States into the dominant force on the global stage. American entry into the First World War helped break a stalemate that had consumed millions of lives. The Great Depression of the 1930s, triggered by the stock market crash of 1929, wiped out savings, shuttered businesses, and left a quarter of the workforce unemployed. Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal rebuilt the social contract between government and citizens. And then Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, brought the United States into the Second World War on 2 fronts simultaneously. The war ended with 2 blinding flashes over Japan. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August of 1945 killed more than 100,000 people and inaugurated a terrifying new era. The United States had won the war, but in doing so had created weapons capable of ending civilization itself. The Cold War that followed defined the next 4 decades. The Soviet Union developed its own nuclear arsenal, and the two superpowers faced off in a global competition that touched every corner of the Earth without ever quite erupting into direct conflict. The space race produced humanity's most extraordinary technological achievements, culminating in July of 1969 when Neil Armstrong walked on the moon while the whole world watched in collective disbelief. But the Cold War also drove the United States into conflicts that proved far costlier than anyone had anticipated. The Vietnam War consumed nearly 2 decades and took the lives of 58,000 Americans and an estimated 2 million Vietnamese, and tore the country apart along cultural and political fault lines that have never fully healed. At home, it produced something equally seismic, a generation of young Americans who turned against their own government in the streets, on college campuses, and in the pages of underground newspapers. The assassinations of Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968, both within 2 months of each other, delivered a 1-2 blow to the American spirit that the country struggled to process. An entire decade felt like it was coming apart at the seams, and in many ways it was. The upheaval did not dissolve with the war. It calcified into a deep distrust of institutions, of authority, of the official version of events, a distrust that would echo through every subsequent decade. The 1970s brought Watergate and the first ever resignation of an American president, an energy crisis that exposed the fragility of the economic boom, and a creeping national sense of having somehow lost the way. Ronald Reagan's election in 1980 offered a sunnier version, and his supply-side economic revolution made the wealthy considerably wealthier, while doing considerably less for those at the bottom. The AIDS epidemic was ignored for years, while tens of thousands have died. The war on drugs imprisoned a generation of young black men for offenses that received little attention when committed by others. The Cold War finally ended with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, leaving the United States as the world's sole superpower, and raising questions about what the extraordinary, unprecedented position of power was actually for. The 1990s brought a technology-driven economic boom, the rise of the internet, and then the dot-com bust that wiped out trillions in paper wealth. The defining event of the era came on the morning of September 11, 2001, when hijacked airplanes struck the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, killing nearly 3,000 people and launching 2 decades of military engagement in Afghanistan and Iraq. The financial crisis of 2008, the worst economic collapse since the Great Depression, wiped out the savings and homes of millions, while the institutions whose recklessness had caused the crisis were deemed too big to fail. Barack Obama's election as the first African-American president carried genuine historical weight, a signal in the country that something had changed. His presidency was followed by Donald Trump's in 2016, the most polarizing figure in modern American political history, whose election channeled deep currents of economic anxiety and cultural resentment into one of the most surprising political victories ever recorded. The COVID-19 pandemic of 2020 and the assault on the United States Capitol on January 6, 2021 shook democratic institutions in ways that would have seemed unthinkable just years before. So, here we are. A nation that began as 13 struggling colonies on the eastern edge of a continent grew into the most powerful country the world has ever known. A nation that has never been what it claims to be and has never stopped arguing about whether it could get there. America is not a finished thing. It is a country that wrote its own impossible standard into its founding documents and has been falling short of it and reaching toward it ever since. The failures are real, but so are the moments when something that looked impossible suddenly wasn't. What holds it together is not agreement. It is the shared, if contested, belief that the distance between what the country is and what it ought to be is worth closing. That belief has outlasted everything so far. Whether it continues to is up to the living. Thank you for watching. Subscribe for more documentary history and tell us in the comments which chapter of history you want to explore next.